Thank you so much, Uncle Shane and Uncle Lionel, and Chelsea. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking from today, the Yuggera peoples. I'd like to acknowledge their continuing sovereignty and the sovereignty of all First Nations peoples. And I want to acknowledge my elders and ancestors and the elders and ancestors of all people here today. I'm here today as a Turrbal and South Sea Islander woman and journalist to say I stand in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. We are currently witnessing a genocide being perpetrated before our eyes, and yet the outlets that are supposed to bring us the truth, that are supposed to act as the fourth estate, the mainstream media, are willfully blind. Their actions or inactions go beyond silence, even beyond acquiescence, and emerge towards complicity. Our mainstream media outlets, including the ABC, are so cowardly that they refuse to even mention the word genocide. This was demonstrated recently when the ABC released a statement after an interview with Labor Minister Tony Burke, one of the few who actually spoke out against the silencing of Palestinian voices. It was retweeted by one of the most high-profile ABC journalists, Patricia Karl-Velis, who wanted to clarify that she did not use the word genocide herself. Yep. In a time when Palestinian journalists are risking their lives to document the truth of what is happening in Gaza, across the ocean in her safe barricade at the ABC, Karl-Velis felt it so important to remind us that she had not uttered the unspeakable, the word genocide. Why is it unspeakable? I think I know, as many of you here would know. They purposely do not want to speak of genocide because by doing so, they would have to also acknowledge that they are speaking from lands which are stolen Aboriginal lands, which were secured not just through genocide, but also maintained through a continuing genocide. The term genocide was clarified for use in settler colonial contexts by the Landmark Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's and Girls Inquiry in Canada. It said in its supplementary report, genocide encompasses a variety of both lethal and non-lethal acts, including acts of slow deaths. This reality must be acknowledged as a precursor to understanding genocide as a root cause of the violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada, and it's the exact same here. But what is happening right now in Gaza and throughout occupied Palestine is unprecedented. The brutality is so intense and the silencing so fierce that it feels incomprehensible, and yet we must comprehend it. I was honoured to share a stage earlier this year with Palestinian writer Saree Makdisi at the Adelaide Writers' Festival, which was targeted by Zionist lobbies after Jewish Australian publisher Louise Adler programmed an extensive lineup of Palestinian voices. But earlier this month, Saree wrote something that really stood out to me. He said, "What we are witnessing, in other words, is perhaps the first fusion of old-school colonial and gendered violence with advanced state-of-the-art heavy weapons, a twisted amalgamation of the 17th century and the 21st. What's worse, if anything could be worse, is the near total indifference on display by so many in and out of the Western world. We are seeing how genocide is carried out when there's a devastating indifference from the Western world and the media, and a nuclear-armed state that feels it has impunity to kill and kill and kill. But through this, Aboriginal people in Australia know that this is an old story, a story of settler colonialism. We know this is genocide because we have seen how a genocide is committed and why it is committed, to disappear us from our land and to secure a settler colonial state. So how do you commit a genocide? A genocide is committed when an Indigenous population are forcibly displaced and expelled from their homelands, massacred wholesale, with their villages destroyed, like what happened in 1948 with the Nakba. This is what happened on the Queensland frontier when our own ancestors were massacred by tens of thousands to make way for white settlers to build a colony. Our graves were in rivers and by the bottom of cliffs. A genocide is committed when settlers are armed with guns and weapons to remove Palestinians from their homes and villages, like what is currently happening in the West Bank, where footage has shown images of armed Israeli settlers entering villages to expel and kill Palestinians. This happened on the Queensland frontier as well, when white settlers were given an unofficial license to kill to clear the land of our own people. A genocide is committed by the reshaping of ancestral country into colonial borders in which spatial configurations determine which bodies matter in which spaces, what bodies are seen as threats to public order, and what bodies are seen as in need of protecting from. This is happening under the apartheid regime of Israel, where Palestinians have their land seized and where illegal settlements are built, where Palestinians cannot walk free in certain spaces, where there is one set of laws for Palestinians and one set of laws for Israelis. Queensland was the model for apartheid. Our Aboriginal Protection Act, which forcibly removed Aboriginal people from their homelands and into reserves and missions, with their entire lives strictly controlled and their movements inhibited by the protectors and the police, was the very inspiration for apartheid South Africa. A genocide is committed when there is a forcible amnesia of history in which the histories of these blood-stained places we walk on are mythologized to make settlers in the colony seem victorious, brave, and benevolent. Palestinian writer Randall Abdel Fattah has written of this as a legal mourning, in which Palestinian histories of the Nakba are silenced in what she calls an Israeli version of Terra Nullius. This is true, ever so true, of this place, in which there are national celebrations on our day of mourning, on our Nakba, January 26, a day of invasion canonized by the colonizers as Australia Day. A genocide is committed when thousands of Indigenous people are disappeared into jails and detention centres, like the 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners, so many of them children, locked away in Israeli jails, out of sight and contained and tortured. We are seeing a mass incarceration of black men, women, and children in this place right here, in which our people are seen as criminals and an affront to the supposed safety of white society. And a genocide is committed with the erasure of Indigenous bodies from Indigenous lands and in the poisoning of country, which is intimately tied to our survivals of peoples as peoples. And I think if we see the images of Gaza that we've all been glued to our TV screens, you see the destruction of not just bodies, but country. These are all the reasons why Patricia Karvelis and other Australian journalists cannot utter the word genocide, even as numerous genocide scholars have said that what is happening in Gaza right now is a textbook case of genocide. But we will remember them for their silence. We will remember the more than 10,000 men, women, and children who have been murdered and the thousands who are still disappeared under the rubble. We will remember them not as numbers, but as names and lives who deserve the right to live. And we will remember them through the media silencing. When I speak of silencing, I don't speak of the fact that Indigenous people, both Palestinian and Aboriginal, are voiceless. As we know, Palestinian people have been speaking for decades about the truth of their lived experience, as have our own people over here. When I speak of silencing, I speak of it as the discourse, the more acceptable discourse that displaces the less acceptable discourse, the language of the oppressed. This acceptable discourse is operationalized against us so that when we speak, our voices become too radical or biased or untruthful so that they go unheard unless we become legitimized by colonizer voices and authoritative sources, those who are always perpetrating the violence. It is used to both make invisible a shockingly visible colonial violence while also constricting the limits of what we can say so that we in turn become the violent ones. It's only the violence of the oppressed that becomes visible. The ABC and other mainstream media outlets are actively silencing dissent. They refuse to report on the tens of thousands of people who are taking the streets in solidarity with Palestinians, who are calling for a ceasefire, for an end to the siege, and for a free Palestine. The acceptable discourse, that which silences the voices of the oppressed, rests on the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples in Palestine and here in this place. A genocide finally cannot be perpetrated without first putting in place dehumanizing regimes of representation that see Palestinians as not people and even as less than people, as human animals, as terrorists, as unworthy and as ungrievable lives. Just as we are people, so are Palestinians. They are not human animals, they are not terrorists, they are not ungrievable, they are not unworthy. They have a right to live free, they have a right to liberation, they have a right to resist, they have a right to defend themselves, and they have a right to their sovereignty, which has never been ceded and never will be ceded, despite the genocidal attempts to destroy it. Silencing is insidious because not only does it cement the status of the other as unworthy of grief and as bodies marked for destruction, but it also refuses to acknowledge the imaginings we have of a future. It sees this future only through the prism of the destruction of another people, and not on the very right of an Indigenous people to enact a sovereignty never ceded. And I believe Palestinians should not be denied their right to imagine a just future. I want to end by condemning the mainstream media, the cowardly Australian journalists who shield themselves behind false pretenses, journalistic notions of objectivity and impartiality which only serve the powerful. Just as they say we are not journalists, that we're activists or have agendas, I say that they are also not journalists. They're propagandists and stenographers for the powerful. And I also want to pay tribute today to the 32 Palestinian journalists, and this is only what has been confirmed, who have been killed by the Israeli genocidal regime, and their families who have been targeted for their truth-telling. They are the brave truth-tellers, so powerful that they pose one of the biggest threats to Israel. Every day they hand us the mantle of bearing witness, and we must take our responsibilities as witnesses seriously. We must never stop speaking, never stop fighting, and never stop resisting for our Palestinian brothers and sisters. In doing so, we must assert their humanity as Palestinian people. We must share their horror and grief, and we must mourn those who are lost, those beautiful Jarjams, those courageous women, those brave, tireless men. Just as we are still here after hundreds of thousands of years, we know that our Palestinian siblings are also still here. And we will love and support and fight for you today and tomorrow until the siege ends, until the occupation ends, until the wall is brought down, until the olive trees regrow. Always was, always will be.